Welcome back, class, to our last section of the unit. In this particular section, we're going to talk about macromolecules. And the word macromolecule is, again, a combination of two words, macro and molecule. Macro and molecule. Macro, of course, meaning large. We're talking about large molecules, but it's actually an oxymoron because even though they're large, they're molecules, and they're microscopic, and we can't even see them. Now, macromolecules are a special class of molecules. They're called polymers. Polymers are molecules that have building blocks that repeat over and over and over again. Of course, poly means many. So there are multiple chains of repeating molecules. Those individual pieces of the molecule, the little bits that make it up, are called the monomers. And that's what repeats over and over again. In this particular section, we're going to concentrate on the four main biological, or if you will, biochemical compounds that are important for life: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. These are all examples of organic compounds. And organic compounds are compounds that contain one very important element, at least, some others as well, but that's carbon. The branch of science that deals with organic compounds is called organic chemistry. Let's first look at carbohydrates. The word carbohydrate is actually composed of multiple words: carbo, hyd, and ate. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. In a carbohydrate, you generally find the ratio of carbon, hydrogen, to oxygen as 1 to 2 to 1. Carbohydrates are our main energy source. The building blocks of carbohydrates are called monosaccharides. So the polymer is the carbohydrate. We also call that the polysaccharide, and the building block is the monosaccharide. They are one of our main sources of energy. I believe I mentioned that above. But they also do other things like form structures for plants, like their cell walls. So here's an example of a typical carbohydrate. This is called starch. Starch is an example of a complex carbohydrate. It is a polymer, and as you can see, it is made up of repeating pieces. These are the monomers, and this is what one of them looks like. Glucose, or sugar, is the building block of the complex carbohydrate. It is the monosaccharide to the starch, which is the polysaccharide. In animals, carbohydrates are very important. Not only are they one of our very important sources of energy, we also store them in case we ever need them in the future. We store extra sugar, or glucose, in our liver in the form of a polysaccharide called glycogen. And as our energy level gets low, if we need sugars for cellular respiration to take place, that glycogen can be released in the bloodstream and broken down and then used. In plants, carbohydrates are stored in two different places. They're stored as starch, and they're stored as cellulose. And that's why we eat plants. The energy that the plant has created through photosynthesis, that sugar, that glucose, which is stored as starch and cellulose, is then eaten by us. And then that energy is transformed and transferred to us so that we can use it to power our cells through cellular respiration. Another group of compounds that are important for supplying energy for organisms are lipids. Lipids are also known as fats, oils, and waxes. The building blocks of lipids, the monomer, is the fatty acid. Lipids are very important. They're designed to store energy. In fact, lipids actually contain, in equal ratio, say, to size of a carbohydrate, almost twice as much energy. They're parts of the membranes of your cells. They produce waterproof coverings for organisms, and they help produce naturally occurring steroids. There are two main classes of fats. There are saturated fats versus unsaturated fats. Saturated fats are those fats which are solid at room temperature, like, for example, bacon grease, if you've ever seen that in a frying pan a few hours later. And then there are unsaturated fats, which are liquid at room temperature, like, for example, vegetable oil. This is an example of a saturated fat on the top and an unsaturated one on the bottom. As you can see, the unsaturated one has some spaces available. That's why it's said to be unsaturated. Remember, the word saturated means filled. And as you can see in the bottom diagram, some of those carbons don't have anything bonding with them, as they've created some double bonds with other carbons. So not all the space has been used for available hydrogens. Proteins. These are the third class of macromolecules that we'll be looking at. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids. There are 20 different types of amino acids. And these amino acids are the building blocks of the proteins. The arrangement of these amino acids are what makes the proteins unique. Amino acids are almost like words, and the protein is like the sentence. So you could arrange the words or the amino acids in different ways and get different proteins just the same way as you would get different sentences. And that's what makes each of us different and unique. Proteins are very important. They help regulate reactions through enzymes, which we'll look at in a couple slides. They control cellular processes. They transport materials. They form the structure of cells, and they help fight diseases. These are very important macromolecules, and we'll actually be looking at them in a later unit. Now, there is no slide for the fourth class. That's the nucleic acids, because we'll actually be doing an entire separate unit on them as well. For that, make sure you look over the reading in section 3, and also remember that nucleic acids, these are the macromolecules responsible for the transfer of genetic information. Their building blocks are nucleotides, and RNA and DNA are some examples. Here also is an example of a protein molecule, just for reference. So let's finish out the unit looking at how do we control chemical reactions within a living thing. But first, before we do that, let's talk about energy, because if you remember correctly, energy is needed by all living things. There are tons of chemical reactions and processes that take place in an organism, and those reactions need energy. That's why we eat food. That's why plants undergo photosynthesis, so they can produce sugars that can power their reactions. And then we eat those plants and the organisms that have eaten them to get our energy to power our reactions. And that's done in the mitochondria through cellular respiration, because the sugar in the end is not in a form that the cells can use. It has to be converted first. Here's a couple of examples. In chemical reactions, basically you have two different classes. You have those reactions that absorb energy in, and those that release energy. And I'm sure you remember those from middle school. Reactions that absorb energy in are said to be endothermic, whereas reactions that release energy are said to be exothermic. But if you do look at them both, you will notice they have one thing in common, and that's this term activation energy. And that's what I want to focus in on right now. That activation energy is so important, regardless of the type of reaction, because without the activation energy, the reaction would not be possible. Now, what is activation energy? Activation energy is basically the kickstart that gets a reaction going. It's that energy that's put into the reaction to get it to start. Like, for example, if I had a pile of logs and I went camping and I just stare at the logs, they're not going to catch on fire and give off heat. I need to add some energy, maybe in the form of a flint giving off some sparks, something. I need to add a little bit of energy to get that reaction to start. That's what activation energy is. Now, some reactions take a lot of energy to get started. Some take only a little. That amount of activation energy can be affected by catalysts. Catalysts are a special class of compounds that speed up reactions by reducing the amount of activation energy necessary to get the reaction started. Because if you can reduce the activation energy, the reaction will get going much faster. Now, the special thing about catalysts is not only do they get the reaction going faster, they get the reaction going without actually affecting it. So they don't actually change what the products would be. They just help the reaction move along. And it's very important, especially in living things, because if we didn't have catalysts inside our cells, many of our reactions would be almost impossible. The amount of energy required would really kill us. Now, with inside living things, we don't call them catalysts. They have a special name. We call them enzymes. Enzymes really are just organic catalysts. That's what they are. They help reduce the amount of activation energy necessary to get the reaction going. They're a class of proteins, as we mentioned before in an earlier slide. And like I said, they can make reactions go much faster. Look at that point there, up to 1,000,000 times faster than those reactions would occur on their own. Now, how do they work? Take a look at this graph here. This graph compares an uncatalyzed reaction to a catalyzed reaction. Look at the difference. In blue, you have the normal uncatalyzed reaction. Look how much activation energy it required to get it started. But then look at the catalyzed reaction in red and look at the difference. Which reaction do you think will get going faster? How do they work? Enzymes work this way. It's actually very simple. Reactions occur because the particles that are going to react come in contact with each other. They're colliding, banging together, and reacting. If there's not enough energy, they won't collide and react. What an enzyme does is it brings those particles together, joins them together, and kind of forces them to react, really. Look at the diagram below. You can actually see an enzyme in blue there. An enzyme is almost like a lock and a key. A key only works with a particular lock. Same with an enzyme. Enzymes will only work with certain substances. Those substances are called substrates, and they will fit into the enzyme at the activation, or what they call the active site. Those substrate will fit into the active site or the activation site like puzzle pieces. If they don't fit in properly, they won't react. Here's a better diagram. Here's the substrate. You can see the substrate fits perfectly into this like a puzzle, and you can see how the pieces interlock here, fits perfectly into the active site. So what it does is bringing this material together, forcing it to join together and facilitating its reaction. And then once it reacts, the products go off on their merry way. The enzyme has not changed the products, it's just facilitated their reacting. Well, here we are, the end of the unit. Can you believe it? And our last slide. Here's some rules about enzymes. As we mentioned above in a few slides ago, all enzymes are proteins. They're usually named after whatever reaction they're involved in. And so there's usually some root word that might make sense to what it is that's reacting, and then it will usually end in ASE. And we'll see that a little more closely in different units when we talk about, say, protein synthesis and DNA replication and those things. They're very specific. A specific enzyme will only catalyze a specific reaction, and I explained to you that in the previous slide because of the way the substrate fits into the active site. And they can be regulated by the organisms that they're in. They can be turned on or off depending on pH level or temperature, helping to maintain homeostasis. And so that concludes our unit. See you in the next chapter.